Hello. So my name is Bill Buchanan, and I host a podcast series on the world leaders in cryptography. And I'm so happy to have a true world leader with me today, Amit Sahai. Hi, Amit.
Hi there.
Amit is a professor of computer science at UCLA and is the director of the Center for Encrypted Functionalities. Amit has been cited in his research over 63,000 times and has an H index of 91. In 2000, he graduated with a PhD from MIT and then moved to Princeton. In 2004, he then moved to UCLA, where he is a professor now. Over the years, he has made so many great advancements, including being the co-inventor of many areas of cryptography, including indistinguishability, obfuscation schemes, functional encryption, attribute-based encryption, zero-knowledge proofs, and multi-party computation. In 2018, he was elected as an ACM Fellow for his work on the contributions in cryptography to the development of indistinguishability obfuscation, and elected as a Fellow of the International Association of Cryptologic Research for fundamental contributions, including to secure computation, zero knowledge, and functional encryption, and for his services to the IACR. In 2023, Amit received the Test of Time Award from the International Association of Cryptologic Research for his 2008 paper, Efficient Non-Interactive Proof Systems for Bilinear Groups. Then in 2002, he received the Michael and Sheila Held Prize from the National Academy of Sciences, and which credits outstanding, innovative, creative, and influential research in the areas of combinatorial and discrete optimization. And in teaching in 2016, he won the UCLA Samuels Lockheed Martin Excellence in Teaching Award. So, Ahmed, what is your current role and what does a typical day involve for you?
Well, first, thanks for having me. And yeah, so I'm a professor here at UCLA, and this is my dream job. I wake up, I go and think about problems that I want to think about. I have meetings with my students who give me wonderful ideas that they've come up with. We just talk about problems. Um, I might if I'm lecturing, then I'll prepare for lecture and lecture to students. Then I come back home and sometimes have some idea on the way, and then I'll just call up my students and we'll discuss the latest idea. And I'm extremely blessed to have very patient and understanding students who deal with all my quirks and are happy to pick up the phone and talk with me. And just having that collaborative atmosphere for research is something that I truly, truly value and really appreciate.
Okay, and by students, you mean your PhD students?
Yes, sorry, I'm talking about my
Yeah,
PhD students who are
yeah,
my primary collaborators are my PhD students, but I also have many other collaborators throughout the world I love working with.
yeah. And so, what were your days like at high school?
Right. So, I was very lucky that I loved mathematics since I was a very young child. Some of my sort of proudest memories from my childhood was when I would be able to beat my elder brother a little bit, in solving some system of linear equations or something like that. And then I participated in some math competitions. My father loved like the latest computers, so I had a computer since I was in second grade, and we would program. My brother and I a we wrote our own programming language when I was in third grade. He was in fifth grade, just for our friends, try to get them interested in programming. It didn't work at all, but it was really fun for us to learn how to parse things just on our own. Um, I had a really wonderful time in high school. I went to a public school in Thousand Oaks, California, and uh, had wonderful teachers, and I had a chance to participate in lots of competitions and meet lots of great students. And yeah, it was a pretty idyllic childhood, honestly. And I think one of the greatest blessings that any human being can have is just having some area of intellectual endeavor that they just love to work in. right? And I think, I was definitely blessed that way. I imagine you probably were too.
Yeah,
And it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing to be able to wake up and be excited about thinking about things.
yeah, yeah. I found cryptography. I read Whitfield Diffie's and Marty Hellman's paper, and it changed my direction. And Bruce Snyer talking about public key encryption really changed my whole attitude. And I adore
Right.
the area, and hopefully students can see the potential of building a more secure and trusted world. So how did you get into cryptography?
Well, actually, again, when it comes to just being incredibly lucky, so I did my undergrad at Berkeley, and one of the professors who took me under his wing was Manuel Blum, the great Manuel Blum. And not only that, but one day he said, "Hey, we're having a visitor. You should come and come to his talk." And the visitor was Avi Wigderson. And so
Wow.
I actually learned about zero knowledge proofs for the first time in my life from Avi Wigderson.
Wow.
And I was entranced right
Wow.
away. I actually was well, I started as a computer science major, but then I switched actually to be a pure math major because I loved mathematics. I thought I would go into algebraic geometry. That's actually what I thought I would do when I was an undergrad. But then I discovered cryptography and theoretical computer science, and just many, many beautiful questions there. And I was entranced, and especially by the concept of zero knowledge proofs. I thought there must be a catch, and when I realized there was really no catch, it's just a beautiful mathematical notion. Um, I just fell in love, and so that's what I started to work on primarily for my PhD, and the entirety of my PhD thesis is about zero knowledge proofs.
Yeah. Good. And so you co-invented indistinguishability obfuscation schemes. Not the easiest thing to say, by the way.
Sorry,
Uh,
yeah. I
you
think
know, it's
should
okay.
have picked a better name, but
It explains it very well. We'll call it IO or
IO
something like
IO is what we
that.
call it. Yes,
So can
indistinguishability obfuscation.
that's right. So can you outline what this involves and what problem it solves?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a very basic problem, which is that let's say you write some software and you actually, you come up with some really clever algorithms, or maybe you make use of some sensitive data to, work out the results of your algorithm, right? Uh, well, if you want to sell that algorithm, if you want to sell that software, you let people download it, right? And then once you've downloaded it, you have the entire code of the software, right? I can't prevent you from having the code of the software because you need it to run, right? And so this like beautiful question is it somehow possible to let you run a piece of software, to have every single instruction necessary to run that piece of software, and yet not understand how that software is working, what secrets it's using to produce its outputs, or even what the algorithm is that's underlying its capabilities? That is the essential question of software obfuscation. And then indistinguishability obfuscation, or IO, is a technical variant of that, which probably would be a little too mathematical to get into in this podcast, but I would be happy to do so if you'd like me to. But overall, that's the right way to think about it, is that IO is a way of uh, transforming a piece of software, like recompiling it, let's say, into another equivalent piece of software, but one that hides the inner workings of the software itself.
And is there much of an overhead? So obviously with obfuscation, you will break for loops into smaller loops and so on,
Right.
and sometimes you make the code very difficult. What's the overhead in actually creating this obfuscation?
Very, very good. Very good. So one thing I should talk about is just my general philosophy in terms of my research, because it comes to bear here. What I've always been fascinated by are questions of feasibility. What is possible versus what is impossible, right? And so with this problem of obfuscation, of software obfuscation, the question of, is it even possible? Is this something that is even within the realm of possibility for human beings to accomplish in some way was open, and it was open for many, many years, and really only very, very recently, and just 2, 3 years ago, we finally settled the question by showing how to construct I/O from well-studied hard assumptions that have been used in cryptography before. Um, so that's kind of where we are right now as a field with regard to I/O. Now, you mentioned what's the overhead, right? So, as a theoretical computer scientist, I can say, well, don't worry, it's only polynomial time. Or in fact, I can say, actually, with some follow-up work, that we did with my students, it's even just a factor of 2. So
Yeah,
just only a factor of 2, but with an enormous additive constant,
yeah.
massive, massive constant. So right now, these numbers are very theoretical, and there's no plausible way to implement the schemes that we have created. But I'll tell you this, when I started my PhD and I was working in zero-knowledge proofs, I had the same sense about all the work we were doing on zero-knowledge proofs. So this is just incredibly theoretical. No one will ever actually use these things because they're so unwieldy, these massive proofs. And then over the years, over my research lifetime so far, I've come to see zero-knowledge proofs come from theoretical abstraction and just the basic ideas with a lot of additional work now, of course, become very practical and deployed. So that's coming, but it hasn't yet come. So at this point, this is still, the big news is that we now know that it is theoretically possible, and then the question is, can we actually make it efficient enough to be useful in practice? That's another beautiful question that I will also be working on, although that's less of what really excites me. The honest truth is, what excites me is those fundamental feasibility questions. What can and what can't we do?
Yeah. And I suppose it's so important with AI harvesting lots of intellectual property and reverse engineering things automatically. So
Right?
where do you think it could be used one day? What would
Yeah.
you think would be the killer app for this?
So here's what I would imagine, right? So we already are coming into uh, the birth of the age of AI agents, right? Where I can have an AI agent and I can tell it, hey, can you, my wife's birthday is coming up. Can you please buy some flowers for me, right? And now think about that. I asked my AI agent to do this. It needs to know my address. It needs to know my credit card number. It just learned something about when my wife's birthday is, right? So it's getting access to all this information. And if you think about it from the point of view of what the AI will do in the future, that information now becomes part of its code, right? Because AI, again, completely transforms our understanding of what is code and what is data, right? Because the entire AI model is a highly processed form of data, but now it is the code, it is the actual algorithm that is being executed, right? Is all that data. So uh, it's great that we can have these agents, but if one of those agents gets captured, right, which is very easy, very easy to do, uh, then all of a sudden all my secrets are at risk. So I think the future could be one where there is an obfuscated AI agent where you can talk to it and trust that it will keep all your secrets safe because it will actually store them in an obfuscated way so that it can still make use of them using, with some safeguards in terms of making sure that it's really talking to you and things like that. But otherwise, all the data that's inside of it will be kept secure, even if you capture the entire AI agent itself.
I think that's a brilliant explanation, a really clear explanation. I used to work in an area called mobile agents, and with these
Mm,
agents, they would hop from machine to machine, and
right.
they would keep their context and their data, and it was always a problem with security that they could be
Absolutely.
interrogated. And so
Yeah.
I see exactly the example that you've given, and I think more
Right. And
research
for
needs to
those of
go.
your listeners who are
Yeah,
more familiar with cryptography, and in that context, I'm sure you know that one of the biggest problems are the cryptographic keys
yeah,
that an agent must have, right, in order to be able to use and do cryptography. it's very easy right now to interrogate an agent and just extract the keys right out of it, right? And so one of the killer apps would be to be able to obfuscate the agent so it has a whole bunch of cryptographic keys inside of it, but they cannot be extracted.
Mm. Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah. So you published three classic papers around 2006 and 2007. These were attribute-based encryption with fine-grained control of encrypted data, cipher policy attribute-based encryption, or CP, ABE, and fuzzy IBE. Did you know at the time that these papers would make such an impact? And could you explain the basics of ABE? And if you have time, could you explain what fuzzy IBE means? I've got three questions in there. So
Sure.
one
Yeah.
was that,
It's
did you really
it.
think that you knew the impact it was going to make?
So I'll be very honest. Definitely not. And in fact, the origin story is that Brent Waters, he was a PhD student at Princeton, working with Ed Felton and working with me. And honestly, we had just, we'd written one paper together. We were just getting started to work together. And I think he had gone for an internship, if I remember correctly. And he had just come back and he said, "Hey, you know, Amit, I had this idea. Like, I really like this identity-based encryption thing. But what if the identity was a fingerprint, right? And you didn't know it exactly because fingerprints get smudged and you don't get it exactly. And so this led to this idea of fuzzy IBE. And I thought it was really cute. I thought it was a very cute natural problem. I thought another thing that was really nice about it was that a lot of other papers at that time that were using biometrics were assuming that the biometrics were secret. And both Brent and I thought that was ridiculous, that biometrics are the least secret things.
Yeah,
If you look at my eyes, you can see my
yeah,
irises. If you
yeah,
shake hands with me, you have my thumbprint,
yeah.
right? So the idea of instead using a biometric as an identity seemed very natural and really interesting. And again, as a math person, the underlying mathematical problem was just very beautiful. And so I was hooked on it, honestly, just by the the elegance of the mathematical description of the problem, which had to do with proximity to a thumbprint, right? So that's the origin story for everything I'm about to tell you. Okay, it was just him coming in and we talked, and he was proposing schemes. I was finding problems. We were working on it, and I also that was also the project in which I really saw what Brent was made of, because there was a certain time when we had a scheme that was worked out, but we were on that seemed secure. We were only able to prove it under a new hardness assumption. That still seemed plausible to me. And I thought, okay, maybe this is a natural place to publish the paper. And then Brent was like, no, 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 no. I think we should be able to do it under the standard assumption, what was called the BDDH assumption. And I said, okay, all right, let's keep thinking about it. And he had that drive to just push through. And so that was one of the moments when I really thought, this is an amazing student that I have here. And I've had a chance to work with him, so much more over the years. Really a wonderful collaboration, wonderful collaborative partner, and just friendship. He's just a good friend of mine now. But that was the origin, right? And we thought of it just this way. We published the paper, but soon after that, I think both of us realized that the underlying mathematics that we used to construct the scheme was actually a lot more general. It didn't have to only be about thumbprints or iris scans or things like that. It actually enabled a richer class of what we then called access structures, right? And in particular, I realized that any so-called linear secret sharing scheme was sufficient to allow this. I won't bore you with all the details, but you probably know the details. but
I've read the papers many times.
this thought of linear secret sharing schemes led to this very natural generalization. I definitely remember talking to Brent and thinking, this is actually a lot more general. This is actually a lot more interesting what's going on here. This idea that I can actually just associate an access policy with every key and a set of attributes with every ciphertext. And in this way, allow a particular secret key holder to obtain the plain text only if the policy for their key matched the attributes under which the encryption was made. And we realized very quickly that we were onto something interesting here. And I had actually just moved to UCLA at that time. And I had these really promising new PhD students, Vipul Goyal and Omkant Pandey. And I mentioned to them that, hey, I think there's something really interesting to do here. And they were both really excited to work on it. And I remember I had a wonderful experience because I didn't, usually when I've started to think about a problem, but I have a new student, I don't tell them all the things that I've thought of, right? Because I really want them to have that joy of discovery. And they did wonderfully. They came up with they reinvented a lot of stuff that I had thought of. They invented other things that we hadn't thought of. And that led to this wonderful 4-author paper that won a Test of Time award at CCS a few years ago. And then so at that point, I think Brent and I especially just knew, okay, this is something special. Like there's something really interesting going on here. And then at that time, Brent was working at SRI, associated with Stanford. And he actually, it just so happened, I only realized this after he and I were already working well together. But it turns out that he grew up in my hometown. We share the same hometown. Totally unexpected discovery later on.
He's in Texas now.
Now he's in Texas, yeah. But so in fact, he had an attractor to bring him down to Southern California anyway to visit his family. And so, he would actually come down very often. And then I went up one day to visit him up there at Stanford. And at that point, we were thinking for a little while about how to reverse the roles, to have a policy associated, an access policy associated with the ciphertext, and have a set of attributes associated with a user's key, which is also very natural. But there were some technical barriers to accomplishing that. And it was in the visit where I came up to SRI and just hung out with him with our whiteboard. And we finally figured out that we actually went through many, many schemes that were broken, where sometimes I would find the attack, sometimes you would find the attack. And we finally came up with one that wasn't broken. And we were able to prove it secure in something called the generic group model, or the generic bilinear group model. And that led to the third paper that you were talking about. So that's the story.
Oh, the magic of bilinear pairings. So many great papers are based on that underlying principle. I don't think there is there isn't a lattice-based method yet. I may be wrong.
Oh no, there are indeed, yeah. In fact, it's an interesting story, but no, I'm also extremely grateful to Dan Bonnet, who, another just funny story. When I was trying to decide where to go for grad school, I was considering Princeton, which is where Dan Bonnet was a PhD student, and I couldn't make it to the visit day, so I had to come like on a non-visit day to visit Princeton. And Dan, just being the wonderful human being that he is, just said, "Sure, I'll just take a day off from my research and just take you around Princeton." And he just happily showed me around Princeton, and I think we became friends right then, or at least I from my point of view, I felt very very fortunate that he took the time to take me around. And it was from him that I really fell in love with bilinear maps. He introduced me to them, and then I introduced them to my own students, and And yeah, so much we learned from there. Now, it turns out that with regard to attribute-based encryption, actually lattice-based techniques are even more powerful, but they're less efficient. So again, there's this efficiency versus flexibility trade-off. But in fact, one way to think about it is that when describing, once again, in an attribute-based encryption scheme, let's say the key policy version, when I give you a secret key, it is associated with a certain policy, right? And that indicates whether or not you are authorized to actually decrypt a particular ciphertext. And when I encrypt a ciphertext, I label it with a number of attributes, and then your policy is applied to my attributes to determine whether or not you should be able to decrypt, right? So with bilinear maps, we were, roughly speaking, able to handle any Boolean formula. So a formula that you can write out in, using and, or, not, right? And with lattices, we can actually handle any Boolean circuit, any Boolean, which is a significantly more rich class of functions. So for example, it could even be that your policy function is itself some AI algorithm, right? And that's something that we don't know how to do using bilinear maps, but we do know how to do theoretically using lattice-based techniques. Yeah.
That brings me on to homomorphic encryptions. I think you worked on ABE and homomorphic encryption together. How would these work together? And do you think ABE is feasible with homomorphic encryption?
Yeah, absolutely. Craig Gentry's amazing breakthrough result, where he first, just came up with a lattice-based approach to building homomorphic encryption, was such a watershed moment, in our field. And then Craig, Brent, and I had an opportunity to work together. And one of the results of that collaboration, which I feel very fortunate that I got to be a part of it, was a way to marry these two ideas together. So we can actually have homomorphic encryption, which again allows you to process the encrypted data, as much as you like, but where that encrypted data is still associated with a set of attributes. Now, these attributes you don't get to change, because obviously that you shouldn't be able to do. So the attributes remain the same, but the underlying data can still be processed, and we can still have, let's say, a key policy associated with the user that has to check out with respect to the set of attributes in order to be able to then decrypt the processed version of the ciphertext. So these are notions that actually marry with each other quite well, and you get the best of both worlds. You get the ability to have access control in the way that we have from ABE, while still being able to have arbitrary processing of data as we have with homomorphic encryption.
Yeah, I use the OpenFHE library just now, and it doesn't have an ABE integration, so it'd be great to really see that advance, because I don't think it's been integrated yet into any homomorphic encryption library that's open source. So hopefully we'll see that quite soon, because obviously to be post-quantum robust, we'll need a lattice solution for it quite soon.
Yeah, although if I may, let me just interrupt and say that certainly from a deployment point of view right now, it's very wise to be using lattice-based cryptosystems to help us to build some level of resilience against quantum computing attack, right? But I think it's extremely important for everyone, all your listeners, to know that the area of quantum algorithms is in its infancy. One of the reasons is that we don't actually have any quantum computers, right? We don't have any robust, error-resilient quantum computers. And just think about how much the area of computer algorithms took off once we actually had computers versus when we, only had theoretical computers. There was a massive, massive development in classical algorithms once classical computers got built. Once quantum computers get built, I think it's fairly likely that there will be a massive, quantum leap, let's say, of development in our understanding of quantum algorithms. And who knows, lattice-based cryptosystems may indeed be insecure against quantum computers. We don't know that they're quantum secure. They're just our best bet right now. So in fact, this whole area of post-quantum security for cryptography is much broader, I think, than most people realize. It's not just about lattices or about a few different areas. It's actually really about rethinking how we do cryptography, period. To really understand how much flexibility we actually have in achieving even basic things like public key encryption and digital signatures. Although digital signatures are obviously much better understood, but public key encryption, for example, it's been 50 years now, right? Or almost 50 years since Diffie-Hellman, since the introduction of public key cryptography. I guess almost, something like that, right? So almost 50 years, and yet the number of public key cryptosystems that we actually have, the number of different mathematical roots, I would say, of different public key encryption schemes is still just a handful. Humanity as a species so far has only developed a few tools for achieving public key encryption. Forget about indistinguishability obfuscation and homomorphic encryption, but even just public key encryption. So I think it's always important to realize just that we are still an extremely young field. We understand almost nothing about cryptography. It's wide open, with so much to be explored here.
I agree completely. And every single day that you read a new research paper, today I read about quantum key exchange with Diffie-Hellman, a Diffie-Hellman key exchange in a quantum computers. The paper hasn't been peer reviewed yet, but that would be a strange concept to have private states and public states within a quantum computer that you could implement Diffie-Hellman. So the Diffie-Hellman method will live on, hopefully in a quantum age.
Well, I'm fairly suspicious of this. I think that might be some near-term thing. But no, and then there's even yet another dimension to it, which is right now, at least so far, what I have been talking about is a quantum computer, but where information exchange is still classical. We can imagine an even more futuristic scenario where we actually have quantum channels between each of us, right? And I can actually send you information that is in a quantum superposition of states. And then you would be able to take that information and store it without disturbing it. We're very far from this right now. I don't think there's any implementation like this at all. We don't know if physically it's even possible. Like even the physics are not well understood here. But if that were possible, then even more avenues open up. And I actually have some of personally, I've only just begun to think about things like that. But some of my PhD students who are now professors are working in this area and, coming up with amazing, exciting results every year.
Yeah, it's great. And you also advance functional encryption. Could you just give us a quick outline of what functional encryption is all about?
Sure, yeah. So in fact, it really comes right back to that story with Brent, where we had invented attribute-based encryption. And again, we would meet very often. We would talk all the time. And it was actually in one of those conversations that we started to think, well, what if it wasn't just access control? What if what happened was that, let's say you as a user, you actually have a function f associated with your decryption key. And when I encrypt a value x and you try to decrypt it, what you learn is f of x, not x. So you actually do not have the power to obtain the plain text of an encryption. you only have the power to obtain a processed version of the plain text, right? So this idea of functional encryption, where a secret key holder only learns a function of the input that was encrypted, was a very natural, in our minds, a very natural evolution of the idea of attribute-based encryption, where it was an access policy that was applied to some part of the encryption, right? So that was a very natural step in our minds, and we started thinking about, okay, what would this be? What would functional encryption look like? And we published, actually the first paper I think that we published on that had the title functional encryption was with me and Brent and one of his students, and Tatsuaki Okamoto from NTT. And we started just sort of getting some very small levels of functionality with functional encryption. And then together with Dan Bonnet, we just laid out the sort of theoretical foundations and definitions and some basic impossibility results regarding this notion of functional encryption in generality. That was, I believe, in 2011. And in fact, showing how to achieve functional encryption was basically an open question at that point for general functions, where that function can just be an arbitrary computer program, for example, right? And then another major twist in the story came where several people in the community started to think, wait a second, maybe functional encryption and indistinguishability obfuscation are connected to each other, right? Because after all, in both of them, the user only learns some output of some software or some function. And in fact, a couple of my students working together proved that functional encryption actually implies indistinguishability obfuscation, as did another set of people, another pair of researchers in my community. They both sort of got the result about the same time, I think in 2015. And so then it became even more exciting because it made it clear that if we can achieve functional encryption, then we actually get indistinguishability obfuscation, which would be an even bigger open question ever since we had defined it. I defined it in a paper with Boaz Barak and several other co-authors back in 2001. So sort of more and more eyes were on trying to build functional encryption. And we sort of another major turning point came. I'm going back, I'm not respecting the timeline a little bit, so I'll go back a little bit to 2013. So in a paper with several co-authors, including Brent and another former student of mine, Sanjam Garg, also Craig Gentry, and Mariana Rekova and Shai Halevi, we came up with a lattice-based method, like a proposal for how we might be able to achieve functional encryption. It turned out that was broken, although it was very, very non-trivially broken. In fact, one of the death knells on that was a paper that I wrote with one of Dan Bonnet's students, who's now a professor at Stanford, Mark Zandri, and one of my postdocs, Eric, where we introduced a new family of attacks that called annihilation attacks that really sort of pulled the rug on this technique. And there were actually many other cryptanalytic, new algebraic cryptanalytic techniques that were being developed that made the entire cryptographic community feel at least conflicted, and some people quite negative about whether, in fact, if it is actually possible to build functional encryption and indistinguishability obfuscation. That was kind of the dark times in the world of indistinguishability obfuscation and functional encryption. And people, it got much harder to get papers accepted. People were much more worried, sort of burned and shy sort of situation, and kind of the community started dwindling down to just the true believers. So people like me and Brent and my wonderful student Ayush Jain, who's now a professor at CMU, and my wonderful colleague Rachel Lynn, who's a professor at University of Washington. Anyway, the three of us started to work really hard on it together to try to see if we could get past this roadblock. And it was actually during COVID, during those dark times of COVID, where the stars aligned and certain we'd been slowly developing a certain line of attack to try to build functional encryption and indistinguishability obfuscation. And we've been trying to publish it, having a lot of our papers rejected a lot, but we never lost hope. We never felt like we always felt like we were making progress. We understood more and more and more, but we were still stuck until there was this beautiful moment where suddenly we got unstuck. The water just flowed through the dam. The dam was broken. The water burst burst through it after collecting over a period of many years of us just staring at the problem and playing with it. And that led to our paper where we finally constructed both functional encryption and indistinguishability obfuscation from well-studied assumptions. And that's what led to a lot of the prizes you mentioned at the beginning of this interview of the podcast.
That's amazing. I think for any early career researcher, then you can actually see a timeline of the evolution of ideas where they're broken and so on. But that focus on actually solving the fundamental problem is so key in research.
It really is. And if I can interject with just some piece of advice here, I think that there will be, I think, especially if you work on a very hard problem, there will be some dark times where things look bleak, right? And there is a line between perseverance and being foolhardy and just being very foolish, right? And I believe what that line is, at least in the context of research, is when you still feel like you have degrees of freedom that you haven't explored, right? If at some point you just feel like you have no degrees of freedom and you're just bashing your head against the wall, it might be time to take a step back and maybe do something else for a while, right? But as long as you have degrees of freedom, I would encourage everyone to just keep pursuing them.
Yeah, I suppose the isogeny field felt a little bit like that when Psych got broken in the NIST competition. Then you could actually feel, because isogenies was a great hope, we could create a Diffie-Hellman type key exchange method and be post-quantum, and obviously it was a little bit slower than Lattice, but that was there. But actually got knocked down, and it wasn't because of isogenies fundamentally. It was obviously the parameters that had been used and so on. So obviously it's key, and you can still see the communities are still existing, still advancing.
And I think that's another, I'm so glad you brought that up, because in fact, there's an even earlier precedent, right? Where Entru, right? Entru was the first, lattice-based encryption scheme, right? Or at least the co-first, let's say, lattice-based encryption scheme. And, they had published certain recommended parameters which were broken. And there was this sense of negativity in the community about, this is probably not a good approach. And now we know Entru was actually not just one of the co-first, lattice-based encryption schemes. It was essentially a homomorphic encryption scheme, before we had homomorphic encryption schemes. And I think that just shows, one shouldn't be distracted by the headlines. One shouldn't be distracted by these blurbs. One always has to look deeper and see where is there actual opportunity for us to evolve the science. And it's so much fun. It's so much fun to do it.
That's right. And I think in the NIST competitions, there is that feeling that if it's tainted, then it's not going to be accepted. It's almost like you get a bad mark against yourself and you don't have the chance.
Which again, if you're NIST and you have to standardize algorithms, they're going to be used by millions of people. I get it. They have to be cautious. That makes perfect sense from NIST's perspective, that they must be very cautious. But from the broader scientific research community perspective, we can't be so short-sighted. We have to keep looking. We have to keep developing the underlying mathematics and the underlying, theoretical advances to be able to understand what is possible and what's not possible.
Okay, so you won the Test of Time Award for the paper on efficient non-interactive proof systems for bilinear groups. Can you think of how that paper has contributed to the research community?
Yeah, that's another wonderful uh, experience that I had, and I think of that as really being uh, a set of papers that we developed, and there it also brings us back to bilinear maps, our wonderful friend. And at some point, I had uh, some inkling that bilinear maps should be useful for zero knowledge proofs, and some very vague, intuitions as to why that might be true. And then I mentioned this direction to our postdoc at UCLA at that time, Jens Groth, and he took that initial spark of an idea and just ran with it and came up with some beautiful, beautiful ideas that we continued to work on. That first led to just the first uh, techniques of using bilinear maps to build actually highly efficient zero knowledge proof systems. So that actually, you know, also relates to something we discussed earlier in the podcast, where, when I started working in my PhD, I thought zero knowledge proofs for general statements, this is, never going to be useful. It's just so theoretical. And yet this line of work really brought some of that work much, much closer to practice. And then the paper that won the Test of Time Award, that was a really fun, very intense collaboration with Jens, where uh, we realized that these techniques that we had earlier developed for producing non-interactive zero knowledge proofs, they actually were even more revolutionary in terms of efficiency when restricted to what are called witness indistinguishable proofs. So a witness indistinguishable proof is a relaxation of zero knowledge where we don't say that you don't learn anything. So, a zero knowledge proof, beautiful notion. I prove something to you and you just have no idea why it's true at the end, right? Beautiful, amazing, incredible notion, right? So a seemingly much weaker notion is something called witness indistinguishability. And that is, I prove something to you, and actually I have many different sort of reasons as to why that could be true, okay? And we think of those reasons as witnesses. So I can have like, well, one convincing reason is this. Another convincing reason on its own is this, right? And the property should be that after I give you the proof, you shouldn't be able to tell which of the reasons I used to prove. So you can't tell what reason I used among the valid reasons to prove the statement. So this seems to be much, much weaker, but what we realized was that it's much more efficient, like, extremely, extremely much more efficient than what we had come up with for zero knowledge. And then we realized that these witness indistinguishable proofs are actually like Lego pieces that can be built and connected together very nicely. And then at the very, very end, you can add zero knowledge to it without a whole lot of overhead, with just a very small amount of overhead. So it sort of changed the recipe, where we first focused on this weaker notion of witness indistinguishability, get quite extreme levels of efficiency there, and then just add zero knowledge at the end with another trick. And I think that did open up a new operating direction when it came to applying bilinear maps to the area of non-interactive zero knowledge proofs. And then Jens, after that, had another amazing breakthrough paper that also won another Test of Time Award, where he showed how to use to build on these techniques to build what are called SNARKs, where it's a zero knowledge proof where the proof is actually much, much shorter even than the statement. So the proof is actually shorter than the witness, shorter than the statement, just extremely, extremely succinct, that built upon these bilinear map techniques further. And that has had an incredible influence on all especially in the area of blockchains where people are using zero knowledge proofs to to implement them and use them in practice.
So do you currently teach at UCL? And if so, what's your favorite topic to teach?
Yeah, so I teach at UCLA both at the PhD level and at the undergraduate level, primarily at the PhD level. And at the PhD level, I'm again extremely fortunate that I basically teach whatever the latest, most interesting thing that is happening in cryptography. So we sometimes, we sometimes cover papers that were published on ePrint the day before, so the day before
Excellent.
it was published, and we're already, getting into it and trying to understand it. So I love that's really dynamic and changing every time. At the undergraduate level, I love teaching just the basic theory of computation course, where I teach about Turing machines and undecidability, and I always end with Gödel's and completeness theorem. I'm actually teaching that right now. I'm teaching that course right
Yeah,
now, and
yeah,
I'm very
yeah.
much looking forward to when it'll end with Gödel's and completeness theorem. So much beautiful things so much beautiful stuff to cover and to teach.
Yeah. And so patenting has had some problems in cryptography if you look at the RSA patent and SNOR patent and so on. And there are many that are against it and many that are for it. What's your opinions of patenting in cryptography? Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Right. You know what what I believe is that we want useful cryptography to be used, right? And it depends on the circumstances. I have seen circumstances, rarely, to be honest, where if there weren't a patent, it wouldn't be used because the patent has some value among the business community or among certain communities where they take that as some kind of uh, I don't know, I'm not a business person. Okay, so but just somehow it's important for it to be used. So I think that is the limited circumstance in which I think patenting can be useful is where, but for the patent, some technology would not be further developed in terms of deployment. I think in the vast majority of cases, uh, if a technology is so useful that it will be deployed, then it's just much better if there is no patent encumbering the development and use of that technology.
And so what do you think the next decade in cryptography looks like? What are the key problems to solve?
Right. Well, as I mentioned, you know, we are still in the infancy of cryptography. So almost everything is open. And I think, if anything, the advent of quantum computing brings that even more into focus in the sense that the paucity of candidates we have, right? The paucity of mathematical sources of hardness that we currently have at our disposal to build public key cryptography becomes much more dangerous because some of our favorite ones will die immediately as soon as we have an efficient large scale error correcting quantum computer. RSA is gone. All the elliptic curve things are gone. All of these things will no longer be useful. And then we have an even smaller set of sources of hardness that we can make use of. So I think, to me, what I'm the most excited about these days and what I'm working on is really trying to see if we can expand that underlying set of mathematical sources of hardness that are useful cryptographically. So can we build completely new kinds of public cryptosystems, based on completely different areas of mathematics or of discrete math? For example, one area that I'm really interested in is graph theory. Can we have graph theoretic public key encryption schemes? Right? That would be so different, so completely, um, completely different from what we see currently, which is all algebraic. And especially, related to that is another really fascinating question, which is about unstructured sources of hardness. So, can we have problems that we can use to do public key encryption that look as random as possible? Look as bereft of mathematical structure as possible, right? Because as a general rule, we've known since the time of Shannon that a random problem, like if you pick a function at random, it's going to be extremely hard to implement, right? Implement efficiently. It's going to take a huge circuit to implement. That's just a counting argument due to Shannon. So we have a sense, that gives us some sort of moral lesson, I believe, that the less structure is present, the more likely it is to be hard. And in cryptography, for the most part, we've always looked for structure because that's what lets us use it cryptographically. So we love RSA because, wow, look at that, it's so beautiful. Modular exponentiation. It's a extremely well-behaved mathematical object. Elliptic curves, wow, so beautiful. They obey a group structure. They're efficiently manipulable. Wonderful. Even lattices. These are approximate forms of linear algebra. Linear algebra, of course, is the very foundation of everything in science and everything in mathematics. And the only twist we're adding with lattices or lattice-based cryptosystems is to add noise, right? Is to add a little bit of approximateness to the linear algebraic problem that we're posing. How likely is it that that is really hard? I don't know. I mean, none of us know, right? We've never been able to prove that any of these problems are hard. Even classically, we don't know that that's true, right? There's still open problems. So I think the hunt for unstructured but cryptographically useful hardness is absolutely fascinating, and I would encourage everyone who is mathematically inclined to think about that problem.
Yeah. And you've worked with so many amazing people that you talked about, Manuel Blum and so on. Who would you say is your cryptographic hero or cryptographic heroes?
That's a great question. So, of course, I have so many mentors that I've learned so much from. Of course, Manuel Blum, Avi Wigderson, Shafi Goldwasser, Silvio Micali, Ron Rivest. I mean, there are just so many. I would Moni Naor, so many people. Oded Goldreich. I've been incredibly blessed to have amazing mentors who really helped me develop as a cryptographer. But I would still always caution that it has to be about the science. We are like, even these great men and women that I've just mentioned, right? Uh, Amazing work that they've done, right? But they, like me and like you, we just have the privilege of being able to contribute to this particular line of thought that humanity has participated in, right? So we just have the privilege of participating in it. And the important thing is to always focus on the science, always focus on the mathematics, and see where the math takes you, see where the science takes you. I think it's very important to always have that perspective and leave the hero worship, behind. It's more about just, of course, being very grateful to the people who have helped you. All of my students have taught me so much. I'm extraordinarily grateful to all my students. But in the end, it's about the math. It's this great divine gift of mathematics, that we have the opportunity to play with and to learn about the structure of the universe, the structure of reality.
Yeah, it's amazing. And my last question is probably
Yeah.
one of my most difficult, is that if you could change one thing about your career, what would it have been?
So, you know, honestly, I have to say, I have had an incredibly blessed career. I have very little that I can that I can say I regret. I would say the one thing, if I could tell myself, let's say when I was younger, is um, everyone is different, right? I know that I love collaboration. For me, sometimes the best case scenario is when I'm talking to someone who's super engaged in the research that I'm talking about. But even just the process of explaining a thought that I had generally makes the thought better and develops it and takes it in new directions. Just the process of explaining it. So the one advice that I would have given myself is when you find people that you work really well with, just treasure those collaborative relationships. And I have had that opportunity throughout my career. But I wish I had just known that even more when I was younger.
Yeah.
Because I think when you're very young, you can sometimes think of it from the perspective of, you know, this person knows a lot about this. Maybe I should talk to them about it. And that's nothing wrong with that. But even more beautiful is just like, oh, I love working with this person. Like we work so well together. Let's just work on things together, and the ideas will flow, and beautiful things will result from those kind of relationships.
That's great. Yeah, a great thing to really end on with the chat. So thank you so much for taking the time. I know there's a big time difference between your time and my time, so thank you so much for dedicating your time and really sharing all of your career and your advice and all your contributions to a whole lot of new researchers who will hopefully be inspired by your work. Okay, so
Thank you
thank
so
you
much. Yeah, it was wonderful talking with you.
and
Bye.
keep up the great work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.